In today's lesson, we will learn how to get information from a user using the input function. We will also see how to check the data type of a value using the type function and how to convert values from one data type to another when needed. Before we begin, let's quickly recap the 4 basic data types we learned so far. Remember, as the programmer, you are the one who decides how a value should be stored. If we look at these examples, the first and third values would naturally be stored as strings because they contain text. The person's age would usually be stored as an integer because it is a whole number. Later, you might compare it with the number 18, for example, to check whether the person is old enough to vote. Height in this example would be stored as a float because I've used meters as the unit. I choose this simply to demonstrate a value that can contain decimal places. In practice, height isn't the best example of a float. A price is usually a more realistic one. Once you've decided that a value should be stored as a float, you should include a decimal point, even if the value is a whole number. For example, write 10.0 instead of 10. This tells Python to treat the value as a float rather than an integer. Finally, we have a tick to indicate whether the person is married. As you learned in the previous lesson, if a value answers a question with yes or no, it should be stored as a boolean, which can only have one of two values, true or false. So far, we assigned values ourselves. However, many programs need to ask the user to enter information. For example, you might ask for their name, age, or favorite color. To do this, Python provides the input function. Inside the brackets, you can include a message telling the user what information you would like them to enter. When your program reaches an input function, it pauses and waits for the user to type something. Once the user presses enter, Python continues executing the next line of code. There is no limit to the number of times you can use the input function. You can ask the user for as much information as your program needs. In real-world applications, though, you should only ask for the information that's necessary. Good programmers respect users' privacy and avoid collecting personal information that isn't needed. Although we've asked the user to enter some information, we can't use it again unless we store it. Just like any other value, the result of the input function can be assigned to a variable. Now, the value entered by the user is stored in the variable username, and you can't use it later in your program. We've already learned how to display the value stored inside a variable using the print function. In this example, when we print username, Python replaces the variable name with the actual value that the user entered. The variable name is just a label, remember, that points to the stored value. Whenever Python sees the variable, it uses the value stored inside it. When asking for input, make sure your prompt clearly tells the user exactly what you want them to enter. Clear instructions make your program easier to use and help prevent users from entering the wrong type of information. How can we check what data type Python has stored after performing a calculation, for example? We can use the type function. Simply write the name of the function and place either a variable or a value inside the brackets. The type function tells you exactly how Python has stored the value. It's a very useful function when you are learning Python and when you are trying to understand or debug your programs. Remember that every function has opening and closing brackets. Whenever you use a function, make sure you include both brackets and check that you have closed them correctly. Forgetting to close a bracket is a very common beginner mistake and will cause an error in your program. Here's something very important to remember. No matter what the user enters, the input function always returns a string. Even if the user types 25, Python stores it as a string. You can easily check this by using the type function. This is why you will often need to convert user input before performing calculations or making numerical comparisons. Fortunately, Python makes it very easy to convert between data types. The process of changing a value from one data type to another is called type conversion. You may also hear programmers refer to this as casting. Remember that not every conversion is possible. For example, trying to convert the word hello into an integer will produce an error. You may also remember from the previous lesson that when a boolean is converted to an integer, true becomes 1 and false becomes 0. We don't convert data just because we can. We convert it because we want to use it in a different way. As you've seen in the previous example, we couldn't compare the value entered by the user with 18 because, as I mentioned earlier, values entered using the input function are stored as strings by default. When building your programs, you can convert the user's input at the moment you receive it. This allows you to write cleaner and more efficient code by avoiding an extra line, while still keeping your program easy to read and understand. Before we finish, let's summarize the key points. The input function pauses your program until the user enters a value and presses enter. Whatever the user enters is stored as a string by default. If you are going to perform calculations or compare numbers, you will usually need to convert that value into the appropriate data type first. The type function is a useful way of checking how Python has stored a value, especially while you are learning. As you continue writing programs, choosing the correct data type and converting values when necessary will become an important part of your programming skills. Congratulations! You made it to the end of this lesson. Before we finish, I want to introduce one more important principle from the Zen of Python. Errors should never pass silently. If your program produces an error, don't ignore it. Errors are Python's way of telling you that something isn't quite right. Take the time to read the error message carefully. It often tells you where the problem happened and gives you clues about how to fix it. Remember, every programmer encounters errors. Making mistakes and learning how to solve them is a normal and important part of becoming a confident programmer. In the next lesson, we will put everything you've learned so far into practice and write your first Python program.